Okay. Mic check 1 2 1 2. It's the Y2K Collector, and get ready to talk about something that might be a bit controversial, and that's the idea of figuring out which is the most important era or decade to collect for. And I think obviously there's a number of opinions. This is a very subjective conversation. And there's so many things to factor, from nostalgia to value to the available market or market availability, the number of individuals in the market. There's so many things to consider when having this conversation. And then also, obviously, we have to think about what it is we're collecting, right? Are we collecting coins, stamps? Are we collecting video games, comic books, baseball cards? The list goes on and on and on. But for the purposes of this channel, we're going to talk about video games. And yes, video games are something, they're a portion of the collecting economy, the collecting stratosphere that is relatively new when you compare it to things like, cards, comic books, stamps, coins, things of that nature. Video games are still fairly new, so trying to decipher which is the most important era or which era is going to have the most staying power is very difficult. Now, I've kind of broached this topic on my channel before, just talking about the differences in eras and collecting and comparing video game collectibles to, like I said, comic books, baseball cards, things of that nature. And a lot of the comments that I got on my channel were that video games are still fairly new when you think about the long-running hobby of collectibles, or the items that you can collect for, some of which go back 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years, right? And so we already know that there is a segment of the video game, not industry, but there's a certain segment of video games, I should say, that I think we could fairly say will not really have much value even today. And no matter, how much farther into the future, it's hard to see there being a large audience looking for some of these old school gaming consoles or even gaming cartridges. And it would probably be, there's certain video games and certain pieces of hardware that in the future will only be appealing to perhaps historians, completionists, people who want to have the complete library of all video games ever created, right? But I think it's safe to say that anything before Gen 3, right, at a large, consumer level is probably, anything before Gen 3, those items are not highly sought after. I don't think that there's a large market for the Atari. I don't think a lot of people are looking for the Atari. Even people who grew up with the Atari, like even people from that era, don't look for the Atari. But I think when you think about the Nintendo era, right? So when you think about everything from the 80s, 90s for sure, and then 2000s, early 2000s, with like 2010 to 2000 to 2010, and then of course you have 2010 to 2020, and then you have where we're at today, and we're in the middle. We're smack dab in the middle of another decade, right? It's going to be 2025 in about 3 months, and there's already talks about us moving away from physical media altogether within the next few years. We've heard that, big box retailers, Target, Walmart, Best Buy, those folks aren't going to be carrying physical media much longer. And it's, the idea is that physical media may not be around for another decade. So just assuming that video gaming goes completely digital by the year 2030 or even 2035, that would have given us roughly about a 40 to 45 year window of meaningful physical media from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s and now the 2020s. So 4 to 5 decades of gaming. And so assuming that that's the window that we're looking at, right? The most meaningful window. Like I said, of course, we could go back to gaming in the 70s But I don't think many people will really be caring about that. So that's the reason why. And if I'm wrong, and if you think that there's a large constituents of hobbyists that would care about that, then let me know down in the comments. But just for the sake of the, where I think the masses' minds will lie, when you look at the Nintendo era, Super Nintendo era, the PlayStation 2 era, the PlayStation 3 era, and then now the era of the Switch, and then moving into the era of the PlayStation 5 and the Switch 2, assuming all physical gaming ends with this next era, which would be the most meaningful? Now, I'm always hearing, whenever I talk about, collecting retro games, NES games, SNES games, there's always the conversation that, the kids of today will not care about SNES games. There's, the conversation that, they'll be looking for something new. But if you follow that logic, right, and you also take into account that physical media is dying, it's safe to say that 30 to 35 years from now, that, kids won't care about any physical media at all, right? Because if physical media is dying within the next 5 to 10 years, that would mean 30 to 40 years from now, most people won't care about any physical media. But I don't think that that's true. I think that for as long as we're here, as long as humans are here, we're always going to be fascinated with the past. We're always going to be fascinated with things from the past, gadgets from the past, toys from the past. And I think depending on who you are, these things will always have value. I do believe that 30 years from now, someone will still have an old school record player in their house, just because there's something about that physical piece of hardware, that physical piece of media, that's so nostalgic and so novel that there will always be someone somewhere looking for something like that. And so I think the same could be said for gaming, but trying to figure out which generation, which decade matters the most is going to be difficult. Now, I personally think, in my opinion, that the sweet spot is everything between the 90s and the early 2000s. So that would pretty much be Gen 4, Gen 5, and Gen 6. I feel like Gen 4 through 6, in my opinion, is the sweet spot. And you can pick any era from within that group, and I feel like those will be the most nostalgic, and those will be some of the most important historical eras of physical video gaming media, because a lot of the ideas that we have today stem from the ideas that originated out of those 3 generations of video gaming. And if I'm wrong, someone let me know down in the comments. But when I consider all of the remakes, remasters, spin-offs, and bite-offs, for lack of better terms, of games that we have today, that seemed to really genuinely be the eras, the decades of innovation, where people weren't afraid to try new ideas, to introduce new main characters, to introduce different gameplay styles and game types, and putting all of the things like graphics and all the tech specs aside. When you think about just the fun factor, that was a very specific generation. And I think 10, 20, 30 years from now, when you have pieces of media from that time frame, I think it's really going to matter. Now, I don't think that you should go out and start grading any sealed PlayStation 2 game that you have, but I do think that for the purposes of just collecting, I'm not talking about gaming. That's another topic. I'm not talking about actually playing video games. That's another topic. I'm talking about collecting. Those who collect, those who enjoy having a solid collection of games, and those who may even collect for value, right? When you think about getting games graded and things like that, I do think a lot of the value is going to lie in that in that 4th to 6th generation. And even if you wanted to think about gaming, right, like actually playing video games, I still think that the bulk of the value is going to lie in generations 4 through 6, because once you started getting to Gen 7 and Gen 8, so much of that was internet dependent and update dependent and patch dependent, especially moving forward, that 30 years from now, if those servers are down and you're not able to update and patch those games, it's just not going to be the same experience. Whereas with gens 4 through 6, you're pretty much getting the full-fledged gaming experience for each game that you play in that generation. There's no patching or fixing. If it's broke, it's broken. You learn to appreciate what was broke about it. So I don't know. I'm really interested to know your thoughts. This is just a thought that I had here on a Sunday afternoon, just considering the fact that we're probably 5 to 10 years away from physical media, going away. And we're going to be left with about 4 to 5 decades of physical video gaming media for collectors to absorb. And what are those collectors going to be going for? Are they going to be going for Gen 7 and 8 stuff? Are they going to be primarily going back and reaching back to Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5 stuff? I think it's a very interesting topic, especially when you consider the ramifications from a value perspective and as a collector. But I'm interested to know your thoughts. Let me know down in the comments. It's the Y2K Collector. Hopefully you have had a good Sunday. You've taken advantage of it. It's been ugly weather out there. It's just been horrible weather. So this is definitely a good day to dive into one of your favorite games. You go ahead and do that, and I will catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.